Welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast, the nature-based show hosted by me, Jack Perks. Each week I'm joined by a guest from the world of wildlife television, art and science. We take a light-hearted look into what makes these people tick and connect with the natural world so strongly, with new episodes out every Tuesday. This week I'm joined by fellow Countryfile presenter Joe Crowley. Joe has presented a host of television programmes from Holiday Hit Squad to Police 5, but is best known for his regular slots on both The One Show and Countryfile. It's here he embraces his passion for the outdoors, and in particular rivers, and recently made a film for Panorama about the disgusting amounts of raw sewage entering British rivers, which is the main topic of today's chat. Now there's a link in the description to buymeacoffee.com, and you can help the podcast by donating £3 to help keep it going, which I'll use for web hosting or possibly a beer. If you could also leave a review on whatever platform you're listening on, that really helps the podcast out. Here's our chat. So welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Thank you very much, Jack. Nice to be here with you.
Yeah, no, I've been wanting to get you on for a while, and I think I contacted you a while ago, but you were under secret orders not to say anything, weren't you, for a bit?
Well, yeah, in the middle of an investigation. This is the Panorama we've just done on sewage pollution. It's just really tricky when you're fighting a war on many fronts and just sort of asking for rights of replies from water companies to suddenly try and talk about it halfway through a project when actually you don't know where you're going to end up. You know, you think you're going somewhere, you think you've got some evidence, but actually there might be a really good explanation for it all. So you can't second guess the process, and so it's nice to be able to speak to you now. We've actually broadcast and we're the other side of it.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on that in a bit, but I thought we'd talk a little bit about you first. So we go, I don't know how many years ago it was now, but my first Countryfile appearance was with you, which...
Was that your first?
That was my first one, yeah. That was it. I popped my cherry on that one. So that was I want to say 2013. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was a while ago.
It was a while ago. We were in Derbyshire. We were on the Haddon Hall estate. And it can't be 2013 because I've been trying to get onto Countryfile myself for many years. I used to do the little sister version called Country Tracks, and I remember my first Countryfile gig was, and possibly the best one I've ever done, was just 2 weeks after my first son was born in 2014. So I joined in 2014. So I think it was the summer of 2015 maybe we did that.
That would make more... Yeah, my memory's a blur, to be fair. But yeah, okay, well, I remember the day anyway. I don't remember the date, but I remember the day.
It was a glorious sunny day. It was beautiful, pristine river that had been sort of lovingly restored, actually. And I know, we can talk about these sort of things, but they'd been very brave up there that they'd stopped stocking. They had a very, sort of respectable and sought after fishery. They would have had, I presume, some very loyal members who wanted to catch fish regularly. And they said, no, we're going to stop stocking this. Let's make this a wild brown trout fishery. And I think when you're into fishing and you just focus on catching, you might think, why would you do that? But the more you learn about fish and ecosystems, actually it's a no-brainer, isn't it? To try and have some trust in nature and going back to that route. And I remember we got you up and we were snorkeling and having a look, and it was beautiful, wasn't it?
Yeah, we got quite close to some of the trout. I remember them darting in and out, and it was a lovely piece. And I think talking to a few fishing clubs, it seems to be one of those things where, as the new breed, if you want to call them that, are coming through, I think that mentality of heavy stocking is slowly dying out. Hope not everywhere, but I think a lot of clubs are kind of switching onto that and thinking, actually, if we restore the habitat, we don't need to chuck in X amount of fish, and they'll do it themselves.
Yeah, I think... Again, it's another theme that comes up a lot, but habitat, we're trying to make it exciting now, but ultimately habitat's always been the boring issue, hasn't it? That actually people cling on to creatures, whether it's a beautiful trout, whether it's, a sea eagle, whatever it is, or otters, people cling on to very sort of tangible bits of wildlife. And actually, they in many ways are the pinnacle, aren't they? They are the sort of icing on the cake of a healthy ecosystem, a healthy habitat, and it takes a lot to have trust in that because sometimes it's a slow process. But think of it another way. Why would you keep stocking carnivorous fish and part of their diet is eating baby fish? Why would you overstock that population. So you've got a lopsided population, and then you've got no young fish coming through, and you sort of kill off the future, and you have to then endlessly keep stocking. You're in a sort of a fixed cycle, aren't you?
And they're normally, I think they're normally sterile, aren't they? Is it triploid they're called, where they can't breed, so they're not replenishing. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess, isn't it? They're eating the native ones, they can't breed, so there's no fish left. So you think, we better put some more in. So it's.
But look, I understand it's very hard, and there's a lot cleverer people than me who've got far more experience dealing with this, and I also understand there's economics involved, which thankfully I don't have to sort of get dirty my hands with. But maybe it is the sort of lesser evil sometimes to do that and to keep money coming in.
Yeah, I think, and it's a recurring theme of this podcast, very few things in life are black and white. And yeah, it's very easy to say, well, this thing's wrong and that thing's right. But when you get down to the nitty gritty, it can be a little bit tricky. And I guess that is what you deal with quite a lot. And I was trying to think how to describe yourself, because are you a presenter? Are you a reporter? Are you a journalist? Are you all of the above? Like, what do you classify yourself as?
I don't know. I suppose these days I classify myself as a journalist, but just someone trying to find that balance between making a living, doing what I enjoy, but also what I believe in, and trying to cover topics that might otherwise not be covered. And I think there's an evolution as well. I just had my birthday this weekend. I'm 39. I'm going to be 40 next year, and I've been on TV since I was 25. And in the early days, I was fresh out of doing broadcast journalism, postgraduate degree, and I just had loads of energy for everything. And you're young, and and you sort of look good on camera, and all that kind of stuff that goes with it. And people just put you on as a presenter, and that's great. And you take as much of that work as you can get, and you sort of try and do a bit of everything for everyone. So, I was a trained journalist, but I'd also got a history degree. So I was making a lot of history programs. I was doing holiday programs. I was doing consumer. I was trying to wear as many hats as possible to please as many people. And gradually that slows down. That has to happen. There has to be a cycle. There have to be other younger reporters, presenters, coming in. And gradually some of that work you were doing, which was just presenting, you were there for a moment. I mean, ultimately anyone can kind of present to a point. So you've got no God-given right to hang on to that kind of work. And you have to start working out, okay, what do I care about? What can I make my own? And when you're struggling for work, and I have it many times, you have to kind of think, if no one's going to give me work, and why should they? I have to come up with a story that's mine. And there is a certain meritocracy in television and journalism, I think, that when you present a story, when you've done the thinking, you've done the research, then as part of the deal, they will let you, whoever you've pitched it to and has said yes, they'll let you present it, they'll let you report on it. And so it goes. And so you have to sort of make your own luck. And I didn't once upon a time. I just had loads of work thrown at me, which was a luxury. But as real life kicks in, you do have to sort of make your own luck. And you must know that, Jack, as much as anyone. You've brilliantly sort of started from nothing and built your way up.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I like I say, I'll take whatever's thrown my way. I'm not too fussy, but I did a film for the One Show on Robins a few years ago with Deborah Meaden. Weirdly enough, we did that. And don't get me wrong, I like a robin, but it's not my area really. So I tried to be enthusiastic. I was like, oh, it's a lovely little robin. But then, so for example, it'll already been on by the time this podcast is out. But I think next week I've got a film on Countryfile about greyling. So very passionate about greyling, love my greyling, and I think that was very easy to slip into. I didn't have to do too much work on that because I'm very happy to talk about them. So yeah, you're always going to be more inclined to be more enthusiastic about something that interests you, aren't you?
You are, but it's part of the job as well, especially when you're doing the presenting side. You have to make the actual skill isn't on camera. It's actually making yourself curious and making yourself interested. And I'm very lucky that I want to know about everything. There is nothing I don't want to sit down and sort of pore over in more detail. So to some people, I don't know what, it could be a very random, dry kind of financial story. But to me, that's an excuse to look into something I've never looked into before. So actually, I'm always excited by new challenges and just devouring information. That's where I find I'm hungry. And if you have that hunger, I think the rest of it kind of works out. You know, you're naturally interested in people, so they are relaxed when they're speaking to you because you're not just there asking them a list of questions you've been given by a producer. You're there because you want to know. And actually, when you want to know, people want to tell you. And then before you know it, you actually get very good interviews. And then the only frustration actually is that you have to cut those very good interviews down to a few seconds or a minute or something, you know. But which is why the podcast era is now so nice, because we can have conversations like this.
Yeah, it's one of the things I really enjoy about it, because it gives me an excuse to talk to people for an hour or so that ordinarily there wouldn't be much of a reason to talk to them for an hour or so, if that makes sense. So it's been really nice to talk to lots of people that you kind of know, but you don't know that well, if that makes sense. So it's nice to do that. And you mentioned about this broad aspect of lots of things that you like, but recurring theme, I guess, in what you do is rivers and that sort of habitat. So what is it about rivers that fascinate you?
I don't know is the honest answer, but I do know I am fascinated. That is the right word. And I'm just constantly drawn to them. And, you know, my background is very ordinary. You know, I am the son of 2 secondary school teachers. I grew up in Norwich. And my parents, my dad's no longer with us, but my parents were brilliant. But they didn't have any interest in fishing or wildlife. In fact, I mean, not to say didn't have it, but that wasn't a part of our childhood. I've got a brother and a sister. In fact, music and the arts was, and we've always been sort of big on that. My brother went on to be a professional jazz musician and all sorts. So, so this came not from something that was handed to me, but just I kind of, it's a funny thing to explain, but I feel a kind of innate connection. And I don't know why, and I don't know where it comes from, but I want to see under the water. I want to experience, you know, I scuba dive, I do a bit of fishing, I do anything I can to try and get in touch with that, because it just, this glossy sheen you get on the surface, that's all most people see. But to go underneath and just to observe and to see these little organisms or big fish or whatever it is just interacting, I don't know why, but I can't get enough of that. I just stare at it and I want to understand it.
I don't know if there always has to be, because often people get asked, why do you like these things? And there's not always a simple answer, is there? And I guess it's partly the hidden, that they're not, you can walk down the street, you can see birds and whatever, but under the water, it is a sort of secret world in a way. Not everyone gets to unless you're a diver or an angler, I guess you get a little glimpse of that. So yeah, it can be hard to put words to it, I guess, sometimes.
But rivers in particular, they have an energy and they have a majesty in the landscape. And when you're by a river, or when you're sort of in a river basin, which I suppose you always are by definition, but when you're actually by that water body, because of the movement of it, and because it's so dynamic, because it's always changing, because it's always responding and trying to carve a new path, and therefore everything that lives there has to go with it, it's this evolution in motion, isn't it? I don't find the same excitement looking over a gravel pit or a reservoir. It's not just water for the sake of water. It is these veins, and the more you learn about it, the more you feel connected to it. You know, growing up, I had no idea in Norfolk that there were chalk streams. I mean, I started out as many sort of teenagers and people do with coarse fishing, and didn't know anything about fly fishing. But it's only now in the last few years I've been going back to Norfolk and going, wow, I mean, they're only short and they're these little fingers of chalk streams, you know, around the Norfolk coast, but aren't they amazing? And yeah, the Stiff Key, Glaven, there's some great ones, and yeah, they're remarkable things. But I mean, it's all rivers to me. I think they're just the energy you get from them is fantastic.
It's a sensory experience, I find, as well. It's like the sound of rivers, like you know, you can just close your eyes and hear the babbling brook, or and kind of linking on to what we're going to talk to next, but the smell of a river, which unfortunately a lot of the rivers around me don't smell that nice, and it's normally either Himalayan balsam, which is obviously a non-native plant, or it's that sort of detergent smell, which for a long time I assumed all rivers smelt like that, until I started traveling around a bit more. I was like, oh, they don't stink like a washing up sink. And obviously that's something you brought to wide attention recently on Panorama, so hopefully people will be able to catch up with that on iPlayer if it's still on there. And I guess naively, but part of that you looked into the pollution and all the problems that are going into rivers. So one of the main ones is raw sewage. And why is it bad for raw sewage to enter rivers? I guess because a lot of people think, oh, it's just flowing away. What's the harm?
Well, yeah, a couple of things there. I mean, first of all, this program was just focused on raw sewage. I am keenly aware there are many, many pollutants in rivers, and the water industry will say, hang on, it's not just us, and it definitely isn't just them. Agriculture ranks as a really big factor here. But sewage and the water industry is up there as well. And you're right. Maybe some people don't see it or wonder what the problem is because typically it's gone very quickly. And this is part of the interest for me, actually, that you can have pollution events that I think until very recently, really, I know people have been brilliantly campaigning on this for many, many years, but only with the advent of monitors, they're called event duration monitors, being increasingly introduced and used, not always reliably, but it's getting better on some of these outfalls. Do we have some sense of what is coming out of these overflow pipes? We don't know the volumes typically, and we don't know exactly how noxious it is at different points, but we know when these spills start and stop, and they're really nasty. And look, in our panorama, I think we rightly had to focus on some of the unscreened sewage because, as ever, and you will know this more than anyone, Jack, TV is a visual medium, and it is actually very difficult to show raw sewage on television because it isn't, perfectly formed human waste as people might imagine it in their head floating down a river, right? It is kind of just grey water. And it is a mix of everything that goes down, the toilet or the sinkhole. And it's unforgivable that people are flushing, sanitary waste and wet wipes, and they shouldn't be doing that. But it's equally unforgivable that these are getting into our rivers and aren't screened out. And we saw awful examples of it in the Thames, which I know Thames Water will say, well, the super sewer and all this kind of stuff is going to fix it. Actually, I don't think it's necessarily going to go as far as Hammersmith Pumping Station, which is where some of this stuff was coming out. Anyway, but the fact that we had so much of it, huge amounts of it on the bank, you wonder how much more is going down the river and then going out to sea. So awful problem. But to get to the nub of your question, it is chemical and it's biological. So actually, I don't want to see wet wipes. I don't want to see tampons in a river. But effectively, that's litter. And actually the litter, by and large, isn't what is going to be killing invertebrates or the river life there. It is, all sorts of things. But I mean, you name it. One campaigner said to me, think about everything in all those products under your kitchen sink, all those cleaning products, all those detergents you have in your house. Look at the packaging. Pretty much all of them, it will say dangerous to aquatic life. Okay, so that is what is going down the sink. That is what's going in the sewers, amongst many other things, be it, I don't know, the reproductive pill and all the, estrogen and hormones and things, be it all the nutrients, from human waste, even drugs. There's been lots of studies on things like cocaine and how you can tell that, in the sewage. So all of that going into rivers is just desperate. And I think we have to get away from saying if we don't see fish kills, it's not a problem. And I think, and we may come on to this, but the regulator has been terribly underfunded from what I can tell, and they don't have many enforcement people on the ground. They will still respond to fish kills, and they'll say they'll respond to other things. But actually what we don't see, and no one's really involved in as much, is these smaller pollution spills. But when they are chronic, and this is the point I'm getting to, I think, is that we now know sewage releases in this country are chronic. These are not acute episodes that happen after a 1 in 5 year storm, or even just a really big band of rain that comes in. These are chronic events that are happening regularly in some places in the country after just a few millimetres of rain. So if all those pollutants that I've just mentioned are regularly seeping into the watercourse, what does that do to the invertebrates? And I'm sorry to keep banging on about invertebrates. Your listeners will be very familiar with invertebrates. Maybe the general TV audience isn't. But, the creepy crawlies. I am not a biologist. and I'm not an ecologist, but even I have an understanding that if you keep absolutely smashing the building blocks of life in these small insects, then it has huge knock-on effects to everything. You are not going to have otters or kingfishers without invertebrates ultimately. You need that base to the food chain. And I think that's what's so damaging. So even where fish can survive, and fish are far more mobile than many of these invertebrates, and can move away from pollution spills. It's less common that they get caught and there is a fish kill. It's the sewage fungus smothering everything. It's the impact on invertebrate life that I think is really, really desperate. Because, this is a bit of a rant, isn't it? At the end of it, what you also learn doing something like that panorama is the phenomenal capacity of rivers to recover. And that horrible sewage fungus we saw in the programme, I think when we were there, it had been untreated sewage had been going to Colwell Brook for 14 days, which then leads into the Windrush. We're in Oxfordshire near Witney at this point. I think in total there was 19 days non-stop sewage going into that brook. And it was smothered in sewage fungus. And those that have seen the programme will know the bit I'm talking about. I have to say, if you go back a month or two later, once the sewage has stopped, the fungus has gone, the fish are there, things are happening again. And I think it shows, not always, but actually often, there is a fantastic potential for nature to get over these spills quickly. That's not to justify the spills in the first place, but actually it just shows that if we treated our rivers, if we looked at rewilding in this country through the veins of rivers, start with rivers and move outwards, gosh, what you could achieve would be phenomenal.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like watching that program, one of the things that struck me, because I have to admit I'm quite picky with the rivers that I go in. I guess partly from a health point of view, but also because I want it to look nice. And so if a river is fungusy up, full of fungus and sanitary trials, it's not the sort of thing that Springwatch typically, unless they're doing a really environmental piece, are going to want with trout in the background. So I tend to cherry pick my rivers, but I do see it occasionally, normally on local rivers. And I think we all have a personal river, and one near me is a tributary of the Trent, but it goes through a council estate, and there's a lot of, I'm assuming there's sewer pipes now, having seen the program, and yeah, it will just be covered in that kind of manky fungus that you showed in the program, and it can be pretty horrific. But then you can go a mile up, and like you say, it's almost like a chalk stream. So it is a shame. And the other thing that really caught my attention on the film that you did was the wet white reef. Like the only way to put it, and if again, I do implore people to check the program out if you can. But essentially, it's on the Thames and in Barnes. I think you mentioned the program.
Yeah,
it's just this mound of wet wipes, and everywhere you look, and it is just shocking. It's absolutely shocking.
Yeah, no, that really took me back actually, and I was really surprised I didn't already know that. I worked with a brilliant producer called John in Belfast who put us onto that, and it was a very strong start to the show. But yeah, it's given actually, most sewer overflows are supposed to be screened. Given certainly where sewage spills out of sewage treatment works, it's supposed to be screened. It's remarkable just the tonnage of waste that's ending up in the river. And the reason that wet wipe reef, which I found really hard to say, we filmed on the coldest day in February, and I'd been facing the wind just because where I had to stand for the interview for too long, and my lips had frozen, and I couldn't say wet wipe reef, and I still struggle today. And I think we cut it out in the end. We let the contributors say those words. But yeah, it was absolutely shocking. We were on the inside of a bend, so effectively what's happening is the water is slower on the inside of the bend, and therefore this waste is dropping out of the water column. And so if that much waste can drop out of the water column just on that bend, in the fast part of the river, I mean, goodness me. And a lot of these wet wipes, they're plastic based. This is all heading out to the sea, to our beaches, to our coasts. We didn't touch on beaches in the programme because I fought very hard just to keep this on rivers. I think huge respect to Surfers Against Sewage and various campaigners, and the progress that has been made with water companies, to be fair, as well, playing their part on our beaches. It's not still good enough, but this was to talk about the particularly fragile ecosystems that are rivers and even the Thames. To see that kind of level of waste, it cannot be acceptable in this day and age.
No, no, certainly not. And you mentioned that a lot of it was illegal. So, I wondered, is it the sort of thing that would the water company say that it's a glitch in the system, or is it something conscious, or is it just that we simply don't know? Like, because it seemed kind of a grey area. I wasn't sure whether the companies are doing it in full knowledge, or whether it's just something that's happening that they're not aware of. I mean, I don't know what's that.
This is where I have to start being a bit careful with what I say, I suppose, so we don't both get sued. But here is what we found. We found reliably, we believe, and this is based on water companies' own data, we believe they were breaking the law and breaking their permits because a lot of the time they simply weren't treating enough sewage. Now, sometimes, in a couple of occasions, they kind of put their hands up to that. And Thames Water didn't really contest the fact that their giant Mogden works is nowhere near being legal. I mean, some works, the amount they're treating is only 85, maybe 90% of what it should be. It's getting close to what they should be doing. Mogden was nowhere near. I mean, I really do believe that is scandalous. And we had to broadcast the panorama at fairly short notice, which is for boring reasons to do with scheduling and the royal prince's death. But I think if we publicised it or had a chance to publicise it more, I think the Mogden stuff would have got a few more headlines because, it really isn't good enough. In other places, they say it's happening because there's groundwater. The groundwater levels coming up and getting into the pipes, and that's diluting and swelling the amount of sewage they have to deal with. So there's too much sewage. And that isn't really a valid excuse, actually, because if you look at the permits for sewage treatment works, they say that in the event of rainfall, now it cannot be that on dry days, albeit with high groundwater, that counts as rainfall. And actually the Environment Agency, I know in recent weeks, and perhaps before, but certainly in recent weeks, have started to sort of lay down the law on this a bit. So I don't think that is a valid reason. But essentially, yeah, look, we worked with some campaigners who had been looking at Thames Water stuff. I think there was very clear illegality in what Thames Water were doing. We then said, let's go and look at a handful of sewage treatment works in other areas of the country. And really, we shouldn't be finding that many examples. And I'm saddened and was shocked to say that we did find quite a few examples across many different companies. Different companies give different reasons and different excuses. But the data clearly showed, the data that we were looking at clearly suggested they were breaking the law. I don't think on the frequency we were finding it that can be said to always be an accident. And I would also say that the most expensive part of dealing with supplying water and treating sewage is treating sewage. And so campaigners will point to the fact that actually, these companies are dumping sewage they should be treating. And ultimately, that saves them money. Potentially. This is a very difficult industry. And it's not just down to the water companies. Everyone has a role to play in this. Ultimately, there's a question of whether we should all be paying more for our water. There's a question of whether Ofwat should allow the water companies to charge more for water so they can invest in some of these problems. I suppose Ofwat might say, well, how do we know it's not just going to go into shareholder dividends if we allow them to charge more? So there's a whole issue here. And again, when Ofwat made their last determination, some companies appealed it and said, come on, give us a bit more money. Some got a little bit more money. But, it's very, very complicated. But at the bottom line, I think, is that the government is intent through Ofwat on people having very low water bills. And given from what I've seen making this program, I think I can say the infrastructure is creaking. It hasn't kept up with growing population or with changes in rainfall patterns, or all these things that put pressure on. It is time to have a proper nationwide review of how we go forward, how much we pay for water, and what the water companies need to do. Because I don't think they've done enough either. So there we go.
We had Fergal Sharkey came on a few months ago, and he was mentioning that
he'd say it how it is more than I would.
Yeah, no, he did. Yeah, no holds barred. But he was mentioning like London is heading for it's running out of water. It's heading for a drought basically because or the southeast of England in a whole really because I can't remember again. Listeners, if you're interested, you'll have to kind of go back and listen to that one. I think it was something to do with just lack of reservoirs and things like that in this.
Yeah, no. I think, and look, I can't remember, but I think it's the last reservoir. Is it 76 or something? Again, fact check that. But it's been a long time, and a lot of London and the southeast rely on groundwater. Groundwater is going to be increasingly scarce. We covered this on the one show when we were looking at the tributaries of the Cam drying up a couple of years ago. Had a really dry winter, and then suddenly all these effectively chalk streams start going simply because we're abstracting too much water. This has been going on for a generation, but it's being keenly felt now. And I think and I'm sure Fergal would have mentioned this, but I think about a year and a half or 2 years ago, Cambridge Water, who are a supply company only, they don't deal with sewage, they supply people in Cambridge with drinking water. I think they were bold enough to use the word unsustainable for the first time. I think they came forward and said, look, this isn't sustainable. We've got a growing population here. The groundwater, if anything, is decreasing. This doesn't end up going well ultimately. And I think London and Thames Water have the same problem. And if I branch out slightly, I don't know if you've ever had Paul Jennings from the River Chess Association on, but he is very strong on chalk streams and aquifers, and there is a situation right now, whatever you think of HS2, that the boring machines that are about to go through parts of the chalk aquifer for HS2, they need to use a huge amount of water, so there's problems there. But also, gosh, what if something went wrong with the aquifers that give us our drinking water in the southeast of England? I wonder. I hope that couldn't happen, but you must get a bit nervous when you're boring big holes through chalk.
You'd like to think that they've done all the feasibility
I'm sure
studies,
they have.
but
I'm sure they have.
Who knows? We could run out. Who knows? But you mentioned the EA earlier as well, and again, this might be another question we have to dance around a little bit. But why aren't the EA enforcing it so much then? I know they are to a degree, but they could do more, arguably.
Well, again, I think this ultimately comes back to politics. I was very disappointed that Sir James Bevan didn't give us an interview, nor did the chair of the Environment Agency. I think it looks terrible for them that somewhere like Mogden, the third biggest sewage works in the UK, is clearly and regularly breaking the law, and either they're not aware of it or they're turning a blind eye to it. I don't know which, because they didn't give us an interview. They put Rebecca Powell up, DEFRA did, for interview, and I was very grateful for her time. But the government seemed to be intent on making water companies report more and put more data in the public domain, which is great. But actually, the water companies already know when they're spilling. They already know the data. It's just whether they publish it or not. So I don't think the reporting is everything. The truth is, I think, and this is coming from people inside the Environment Agency I've spoken to, is that clearly there are a lot of very good people in the Environment Agency. There are a lot of people on the ground that you and I will have met who deeply care. They don't go into a career in the Environment Agency to get rich. They go because they want to do their bit and they want to safeguard the environment in this country. And the enforcement officers just aren't there. So one person I spoke to anonymously for the programme told me they had 7 or 8 enforcement teams in their patch before 2010. Now they have 1.5. That many, the fraction of staff they now have to enforce is just not adequate. And many of the people who've joined since 2010, who make up that small number of enforcement officers, barely know what a sewage works looks like. Because since 2010, just for those who don't know, since 2010, we decided in this country that effectively the water companies were going to mark their own homework. Operator self-monitoring. So there are lots of conditions to permits at sewage treatment works, and the water companies have to take samples and check that they're not putting too much, whether it's phosphates or what else into rivers, and check that their effluent, their treated effluent, what comes out the end of the process is up to scratch. And they do those tests themselves. I spoke to another whistleblower who said, look, at our company, we always knew when the tests were going to happen. We're supposed not to know. We're supposed to be someone from a different part of the company comes and does the test, but we know. and we will do things we wouldn't normally do. We'll switch things off or turn things on for that 24 hours to make sure we pass the test. That's a huge allegation, and not one that I've been able to fully substantiate, not one that was in our program, but I am telling you what whistleblowers told me, So, and look, we need enforcement, because with the best will in the world, and some water companies may be trying to do the right thing, you still need somebody checking up, and you need good numbers of expert people out there, and the numbers of tests being done by the Environment Agency, the numbers of prosecutions being carried out, in my opinion, from what we've seen in the research to this program, it just isn't sufficient. And when you don't have sufficient enforcement, unfortunately, you're going to get problems and you're going to get illegal behaviour.
Yeah, I think that mirrors a lot with the EA, because they get a lot of flack, and I do feel for them. I think, like, because of the reductions in staff and whatnot, and I think more needs to be done. They need to hold their hands up to bits and bobs. But I mean, if you look at kind of fisheries, more my side of things. But I think for the entire east of England, from the Humber down to East Anglia, there's something like 2 officers to enforce like rod licenses and stuff like that. So how is that practical? So
it's tricky. And what DEFRA will always say, or the Environment Agency will always say, is look, actually we're fine. We've got a huge budget, and I forget what it is. It's like 4.5 billion or something. And they'll say, and it sounds very good, and it sounds like, okay, you're right, we shouldn't be worried. But when you look into that budget, you look into where it goes. Predominantly, it goes into flood defences. I'm not questioning that, quite right. People, can't have their homes and businesses flooded, but I'd implore listeners to sort of dig a bit deeper, because actually I don't think the resources are there for enforcement. I don't even think the fines, when they do prosecute people, and Thames Water or whoever gets a £20 million fine, I don't think that goes back into enforcement. I think that goes back into a general pot, not enforcement. That's what people on the ground at the Environment Agency have told me as well. I don't know that's definitely true. I'd have to get their response, and we didn't get an interview, so I'll leave that hanging. But, that's... Yeah, there is a lot more that needs to be done, and ultimately, it's a knock-on from austerity. Whatever you think of austerity, we had to cut back public spending, and this is one of the areas where I think it's been keenly felt since 2010. Yeah,
no, it's bound to be in that situation, isn't it? Well, I'm going to end on one last thing, which is a slightly I was going to say more positive note, but I don't know if it is, which is how Brexit is essentially fucking up our eels is the only way I can put it. So I think was it on Sunday you did a piece on Countryfile with eels, and because I know Andrew very well, and I thought, oh, this will be. In fact, I don't know if he mentioned, but I was going to come along that day. I was actually going to come, but because I didn't realise how far it was, and I couldn't find anywhere to stay, and obviously travel at the minute is a little bit tricky. But I was going to come and film the release, so I'm doing it with him at the end of April. He's going to catch some elders for me and get some footage of them.
Yeah, and this was the sort of first attempt, really. So there'll be, here we are. We're recording this in sort of mid-April. There's at least 2 sets of big tides still to come with eels this year. I mean, eel numbers. We did eels on Countryfile a while back. We were looking at the illegal trade, and made a bit of progress with at least showing that, although people like the Sustainable Eel Group have done sort of brilliantly to get a good, legitimate system going, where fishers are involved in that system and rewarded for catching, which is eels, which are then bought by restocking projects, and that's good. There is still an illegal side, sadly, and I think it's a very serious illegal side. It's all wrapped up in organised crime and all sorts going out to the Far East. But but the numbers, I think there's a bit of optimism now. I think some of the recruitment numbers of young eels coming in the last year or two look like the decline is slowing, stopping, or even being reversed, which is great. And the film we made was a positive one, because look, Brexit's a funny old thing, and it's been very difficult to predict. Yeah. That's my very diplomatic summary of Brexit. Funny old thing. It's been very difficult to predict all the impact it's had, and I don't know if anyone really thought it would happen with this, what is ultimately quite a small industry. So we're not talking about this, Scottish fishermen. It's their livelihood year round. There are very few people to do with eels that get a year-round livelihood from them. There's a couple of buyers, and sort of my sympathies are with them because they can't operate this year. But mostly the people catching the eels have other jobs, or they're retired. And this pays for their holidays each year, or this pays for, it's a nice bit of extra cash coming in. And they love the eels, and they're passionate about it, and they're a good bunch. And so this year, just to explain to listeners, essentially, eels are critically endangered. So if you're going to trade them between two countries, both countries have to agree. And Europe didn't agree for our eels to be caught and sent there. So suddenly, we don't use eels in this country. So suddenly there is no legitimate way eels can be caught and sold, including to Northern Ireland because it's within the customs union. And each year, several million or however many go to Lough Neagh and get stocked there, and then they're caught as adults later on. So a bit of a problem, but I thought what Andrew was doing with Sustainable Eel Group is fantastic in that he was trying to ultimately get a pot of money from the government to pay the fishers to catch the eels, and then using those catches to actually restock in other places in the UK. That is a great idea, or it seemed to me a great idea. I don't think the government, these things are often slow and bureaucratic, have been very forthcoming with money. But what's very heartening is that even without the money, a lot of fishers who say, well, look, I've done well out of this over the years, are buying their rod license, which costs them 85 quid or whatever it is, and are turning out, it's not a rod, is it? It's a license to fish. You don't fish for a rod, but yeah, you'd be there a while if you were trying to get them on a yeah, exactly. Anyway, they are turning out, they are catching, and I think we saw 150,000 released upstream of a barrier, and that's the whole point in this country. If you think about Somerset Levels, you think about what would have been great wet habitat, this big sponge of landscape along the west coast or the southwest as well. It isn't there anymore. We drained it, we farmed it, we grow food that we need to grow. So I'm not being critical, but I'm just explaining that we have lost that habitat. And the habitat that is still there, we have flood barriers, we have weirs, we have all sorts of problems. So actually, the more we can lift some of these eels out of the Severn and the Parrett, where they are sort of just trapped in huge numbers, and there's no point to them all being there. You need to spread the eel love. You need to put them around the country, and to be fair to them, because I've been a bit critical in this podcast, but the Environment Agency did turn around quite quickly and give Andrew permission to move them to other places in the catchment. They also turned around very quickly and gave me permission to catch some eels that night on camera, which I'm very grateful for. So it's a really nice idea, and actually the idea of the film, and I hope it came out, was sort of a rewilding project. So it's sort of snatched from the jaws of Brexit defeat, that actually we can use this and have a really positive upturn, and there are some people that really care, because the worry is if years and years of work of having a really good system where everyone's legit, everyone's on board, if that falls away overnight, of course there's going to be some temptation for some people to go back to the dark days of illegally catching, of trying to put them in suitcases and taking them out to Asia. So yeah, I applaud. There's actually optimism in the eel world. We often talk about, sewage or bad news stories. There are some very good people doing some very good things, and the eel numbers look, touch wood, like they may have stopped declining. And that's a pan-European effort. That's Environment Agency. That's everyone involved. Wildlife crime as well. So yeah, that's a positive note, I hope, to end the podcast.
The Severn acts as a funnel, doesn't it? If you look at, it's kind of perfect. So the majority, because people might say, why don't they do it themselves? Because the eels kind of get funneled up the Severn and they get to Tewkesbury and they struggle. I think it's Tewkesbury, it might be the Weir up, but they struggle to get up.
Weir at Tewkesbury.
That's it. So if they stay there, they're just going to get eaten by everything when they could go upstream and carry on with their lives. And one of the facts Andrew told me, which I think is mind-blowing, is pre-industrial revolution, eels made up 50% of the fish biomass around the UK. That's how numerous they were. One in every second fish you would catch would be an eel, because they were so numerous. And now, they're in some places they're completely gone. Other places you get the odd one, but that's how numerous they were. So that's what the levels that they should be at. And so many animals, and people eat them. Smoked eels I quite like smoked eel. If it's sustainable, I should put my hands up. But it's quite good. But bitterns love eating them, and otters love eating them. So Yeah.
And that's the point. They are meant to be eaten. So, and the reason they arrive in such massive numbers, it's the same as invertebrates are in massive numbers, is that they are that bit of the food chain that everything is supposed to predate on, really, in their early life. And then some of them will grow, survive, and return to spawn. And as you say, they are trapped in these congregated sort of spaces. They congregate there, and actually you need to share that. It doesn't just need to be things eating them in the Severn and the Parrett. They need to be shared around the country. And I do wonder, and this is just a very cod bit of theory, but when we look at given this remarkable stat you just mentioned about them used to be 50% of biomass, when you look at things like the problems we've got with salmon, declining numbers of salmon, and clearly they are getting closer and closer to extinction. You wonder, and seabirds coming further inland, and I know lots of salmon fishers, of which I'm not one, but a lot of salmon fishers do sort of moan about seabirds and gooseanders and all that eating them. Well, what about if those eels were still there in those big numbers? Would the young smolts be predated upon in the same way? What if that food source was more abundant? All these things are so complicated, including catches of sand eels in the North Sea. You wonder if some species are taking the hit for there being fewer eels, because eels are all around the UK. They're this wave of protein that wash up once a year. And as you say, the funnel in Bristol, it concentrates them beautifully, and that's why they're caught there, because you just wouldn't get them in numbers in Lincolnshire or Northumberland, but they are there, and they are arriving at this time of year, and it's sort of nature's bounty, and I hope in our lifetimes we see it returned. I hope we see those numbers just keep building and building and building, because every single humans, but every part of our ecosystems will benefit if that's the case.
Yeah, no, it's got to. I mean, I'm sure someone's done research on it, but it's got to have had an impact in some degree. But yeah, who knows? We might. I mean, I'm about as far inland as you can get in Nottinghamshire, so we don't have a huge amount of eels, but we do get the odd one, and I'm like, bloody hell, you've come a good way up. Some of the eels on the Trent, I think where I live, it must be like 7 weirs they've had to cross. So like how they've done that. I mean, and you think if there was weirs weren't there, they'd obviously shoot.
Well, they're survivors, aren't they? And the adults can crawl over, can come out and crawl over obstacles on sort of misty, damp autumn nights. The young ones do their best. You've seen them probably, those pictures of them crawling up sort of wet sides of a weir and just trying to wriggle their way up. But they are remarkable creatures. And again, like the salmon, they have the inverse direction of travel, don't they? But like the salmon, they tell us so much about both our freshwater systems and our marine ecosystems.
Yeah, no, definitely. So there is light at the end of the tunnel with some of our rivers anyway. But
fingers crossed, yeah.
Fingers crossed. Well, look, buddy, it's always a pleasure to have a waffle about rivers to you and catch up. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Jack. Been a pleasure.
All right, cheers. That was Joe Crowley. It's some sobering stuff thinking about all that waste entering rivers. In 2020, raw sewage was discharged 400,000 times, equaling over 3 million hours of it entering rivers. We simply have got to do better than that, and it's important that river champions like Joe are highlighting this. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter @TitBearded, and there's the Facebook page, The Bearded Tits Podcast. In next week's episode, I'll be talking to Jessica Mitchell, who is a wildlife and underwater camerawoman, having worked on various blue-chip nature series, and we delve into some of the heavy issues, like why so few women are in tech roles in wildlife filmmaking. Is there a high number of privileged people in the industry? And her advice for making a start in this career. It's going to be a great one. This has been the Bearded Tits Podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.